those manufactured earlier were inferior tactically and technically to German designs. By the end of the war, British tanks like the Cromwell and the Churchill had been given more powerful guns, but their designs were at least 2 years behind the Germans, and the bulk of British armored units were operating American-built tanks. The Germans encountered more challenging opposition in the East. The invasion of Russia promised more victories for Hitler's war machine. In the summer of 1941, some 3,350 German tanks took on over 26,000 Soviet machines. About 3/4 of the Red Army strength was made up of light tanks, however, and they could offer little resistance to the rampaging panzers. German records estimate that at least 17,000 older Russian tanks were destroyed in 1941, which by any standards must be regarded as a brilliant victory. It had one unintended result. The loss of so many light tanks meant that in 1942, the most numerous armored vehicle in Soviet use was the superb T-34. Better armed and armored than the heaviest German tank, it was only the poor Soviet tactics that allowed the Germans to dominate battles in 1942. The T-34 operated together with the KV-1 heavy tank. Even bigger than the T-34, it was also armed with a powerful 76.2mm gun. The T-34 was so good that the Germans wanted something to counter it. Part of the solution was to improve the guns and armor of the Panzer III and IV. Since the basic designs of these tanks was so good, they were able to fight and remain effective from the beginning of the war to the end. But it was not enough, and 2 new German tanks were hurriedly developed. The massive 56-ton Panzer VI Tiger, armed with a powerful 88mm cannon, was not the most mobile of machines. However, its thick armor meant Allied anti-tank guns couldn't take it out, and it could destroy any tank in the world. The design of the smaller Panzer V Panther was influenced by the T-34. More mobile than the Tiger, it had well-sloped armor to deflect projectiles and was armed with a long, high-velocity 75mm gun. Both the Panther and the Tiger were superb fighting machines, but they were very complex. German industry, struggling under the Allied bombing campaign, could never build tanks in large enough quantities to match the Allies, especially after the United States joined the war. The Americans were hesitant to appreciate the full potential of tanks. In 1939, when the U.S. Army had only 2 cavalry regiments equipping 1 armored brigade, it could field less than 1,000 armored vehicles, including fewer than 500 tanks. The success of the German tanks in 1939 and 1940 greatly impressed the U.S. War Department, and even before the fall of France, they decided to expand the U.S. Army's armored capabilities. By March 1943, 16 armored divisions had been established and equipped. A further 65 independent tank battalions were in service by the end of 1944, together with 17 amphibious tractor battalions. To equip the massive expansion, the Army could call on the impressive output of U.S. industry. The older vehicles in service in 1940 were quickly replaced by new designs. These were perhaps not quite equal to contemporary German or Soviet tanks, but they were practical, reliable, and in the case of the M4 Sherman medium tank, available in large numbers. Although undergunned, the Sherman provided the backbone of the U.S. armored force during the war. It was also used by most British armored divisions, which counted on its reliability, ease of maintenance, and sheer weight of numbers to offset its inferiority against the German tanks. More Shermans were built than any other Allied tank in World War II, a tribute to the American genius for mass production. When production ceased in June 1945, 49,234 Shermans had been built, a figure that exceeded the combined British and German tank output and was matched only by Soviet production of the T-34. Through the jungles of the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia, both the Americans and the Japanese consistently used tanks in their World War I roles as infantry support weapons or as movable strongpoints. American armor had less opportunity for classic blitzkrieg tactics in the Pacific, but they were nevertheless crucial in expelling Japanese forces out of their island fortresses. As the war turned against the Germans, the variety of armored vehicles produced by German industry was dazzling. Powerful 8-wheeled armored cars like the Puma, self-propelled artillery in every shape and size, armored half-tracks to carry troops into battle, self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, massive tank destroyers, and many more. But the Germans could not produce as many vehicles as the Allies, and for every T-34 or Sherman destroyed, there were 10 replacements on their way from the factories. Hitler's last major action, the Battle of the Bulge, saw the ultimate wartime panzer, the King Tiger, thrown into the battle. But even that was not enough to counter Allied numbers and air power. It was only a matter of time before Hitler fell, and it was the tank that led the Red Army into Berlin. During World War II, the major powers continued to build three main types of tank. Light tanks were used for scouting. Medium tanks provided the punch for mobile war. And heavy tanks were designed to dominate other tanks. That trend continued immediately after the war. American troops in Korea used M24 light tanks and updated versions of the M4 Sherman and the larger M26 Pershing. But heavy tanks soon fell out of favor. In the 1950s, a new type of vehicle emerged on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The main battle tank, or MBT, combined the fighting power of the heavy tank with the mobility of the medium tank. Building on the classic wartime T-34, the Russians introduced a series of effective tank designs from the T-54 through the T-55 and T-62. They became familiar from their appearances at the great Soviet parades in Red Square. But their greatest concentration was in Eastern Europe. Massed behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet and Warsaw Pact armored forces were poised to sweep across Western Europe had the Cold War ever